Hey folks, welcome to Fischer Paints. This month we're going to talk about something really cool. We're talking bucket list item here, guys. I've always wanted to paint Marvel superheroes. I even minored in superheroes and comic book art in college, and I've almost never done superhero stuff. So when Magic the Gathering started doing the Universes Beyond and they started tapping into the superhero genre, oh my God, there were a few at the top of my list that I wanted to paint, and one of them is this painting right here, which is the Green Goblin. So saddle up, web slingers, we're going for it. One of the things I loved about doing this set was going back into the old school comic book things. You can see my influences right here. We're talking pajama costume era, you know, really early Bronze Age Marvel stuff. And this is my original rough drawing, but you've got to understand, I just don't get this in one pass. It takes many, many passes. You can see right here, that's sort of my process. Nothing just falls out of my head onto the paper. It's steps and steps. So by the time you see this, there's like 9 layers of drawing. I'm checking reference to making sure things are going good with skateboarders, for instance. Then I shoot reference of myself taking on some of the more intense poses. And then from that rough, I'm going to do this graphite drawing right here. And then we're going to scan this into the computer because that makes everything nice and even. And we're going to start painting. We printed it out and we mounted it to panel. And now I'm doing my slurry, my dirty texture value. I'm basically trying to set up middle values for the entire piece at this stage. I'm working in acrylic paint and I'm using a blow dryer to push around those little drops of paint to really increase and hype up the texture, because I know I'm going to be covering it with translucent paints, as you're seeing here even, but we'll be able to see some of that texture peek through here and there. Now you notice my background is just a bunch of buildings. They're pretty simple, really. I did some kind of fisheye perspective, but the buildings really harken back to that early Bronze Age Marvel stuff. Very simplistic buildings. And this is all just setting in that acrylic and setting up my major movements. You can see I'm going in with some blue. It's all very soupy paint. Lots of water added to this, or maybe some matte medium to try to loosen it up. The idea is I don't want to totally cover my drawing. I want to be able to see it through this painting stage. Even doing some local color, getting the green in there. And I'm just using FW acrylic inks and some tube paint, and it's kind of just me making a mess and just kind of figuring out, okay, how far can I push this value here? I can already start incorporating some gradients into the leg. And this is going to save me a lot of work later on, or at least that's the hope. Even pushing that rear leg into shadow, really establishing the base middle values for every element that you see here. All acrylic still at this stage, and we'll switch to oil pretty soon. Those explosions even were referencing the old school comic book stuff. And this is kind of a slow pass over it, so you can really see how everything has pretty much been established. Once these middle values are established for everything, and I can still see my drawing through the translucent paint, I'll be able to work things up a step lighter and a step darker. Let's start with the background. I need to opaque out. I can't just have this texture everywhere. It'll be too busy. It'll be like static on a television screen or something, right? So I've got to opaque it out in some areas, let it come through in some areas. And I'm kind of thinking this sort of like a checkerboard, to be honest with you. This is like bright and dark values stacked up to each other to kind of create this level of space. You can see I usually use a gap between the white elements, right? And that takes you back and forth throughout the piece. Makes things feel like they're going back in space, or certainly have a little bit more visual interest in them. And we're in oil paint right now, by the way, folks. We've switched over. And I like the extra blending time, especially in areas like this where I really want things to be a little creamier and I want to do a lot of gradients. Gradients are much easier in an oil paint stage. And I'm trying to feel my way through some of these explosions and these clouds, letting them blend together in some spots, but also letting the strokes kind of, you know, stand alone in some areas. You'll see me pull out a little white rubber spatula at times where I can paint through something like the pumpkins and then carve it off with the white spatula. I'm paying attention to my gradients that are going to be happening behind this figure. And you can see I will pull out other rubber combs, sometimes tiny ones that are only like a 1/4 inch to kind of clean off some areas. But a lot of the work is being done with that long liner brush you see in my hand right now. It's a Robert Simmons white sable liner brush. Spatula came out again there a second ago. And that's letting me go in and do the tiny details. But essentially, my friends, it's like tinier and tinier checkerboards, right? Of positive and negative shapes, light and dark, light and dark, light and dark, bouncing all over each other. I want some of this to blend together though, and I don't want to have a ton of contrast in areas. So you can see the values, especially as they get towards the Green Goblin right at his hip there, are getting closer in value to each other, or at least they're blending together a little bit more. As I get away from him out towards those buildings, more contrast comes into play. But I want to keep it quiet behind him so I don't start competing too much with him. Spattering some turpentine into that wet oil paint, and it's eating little holes in it, and does this job of kind of blending things together. Hot temperature shift here, right? I didn't want to just do that cool blue everywhere, so I got out some cadmium green, the Gamblin paint, I'm sure. And I'm just cutting a little bit of that in there to set things off. And it's kind of this sickly green, which I thought added to it. Now, the explosion of the sky kind of radiating out behind everything, it's sort of me thinking about speed lines. I mean, they're used in comic books traditionally, but I'm not really using them as speed lines here, but just the energy and the action that exploding verticals have, or those diagonals have, sets things up. Again, look at the building. Pretty simple, right? I'm just going for some big shapes, some pretty much squared off windows, and just a few bevels. They're basically big rectangles with little rectangles on top of the big rectangles and then little holes cut within them. I wanted those explosions, again, because I'm leaning back on the Bronze Age Marvel stuff, to have that bit more of a graphic vibe to them. So I didn't want them to be quite flat stickers, but they're much more two-dimensional than other things. Look at that paint just dripping down, that turp melting through stuff. You know I'm a texture junkie, so I'll probably leave all that. And you can see that I'm doing a temperature change here from those grays in the building that's right behind his hand into some more blues, affecting some things down below. But all of this is done on that super warm yellow-orange underpainting that we started with the acrylic. And believe it or not, that underpainting is affecting these colors that I'm putting on top of it, where it comes through ever so translucently. Yeah, I'm just thinking about those forms. If you've ever seen a cube, like a Rubik's Cube, it's just kind of that. It's just a more involved Rubik's Cube, I guess. Again, positive and negative. Light clouds on dark clouds on light clouds, back and forth and back and forth. Makes a nice patterning and makes for an interesting surface. This is intense, though, this whole background, man. It took quite a while to do all this. And slowly I'll go to smaller and smaller brushes and do little details and little details and little details. Spattering more turp into it. Let's start painting the figure. All right, I decided to go in on his pajama outfit first. And I'm just nailing it with a few darks. Remember, I set up that great middle value. And now I'm punching in some lights. I'm looking at some of that reference we were talking about earlier with the skateboarders and stuff and seeing how light falls on bodies. And that's my first pass at the torso with a bit of foreshortening going on there. Smaller brush comes in, and I'm basically kind of redrawing and recontouring a few things with a smaller brush. A little bit of cross-hatching coming in there with the paint too. Cross-hatching with oil paint, right? That's going to start adding kind of a sculptural feel to things. I've got the reference I shot of myself with the arm. That's what you can see to my left there. And that's showing you where the basic planes of the deltoid and the bicep and those kind of things are. And even the reference I took of my head earlier, I'll be using to try to imply some of that lighting onto the Green Goblin's face when we get to it. Totally have to redo this hand. Very sloppy at the moment. Looks like chicken fingers or something like that. So I never really established that totally clearly in the drawing, I felt. So I had to go back in and really pay attention to the reference I shot and contour it out a little bit. But again, I'm always thinking about those planar shapes. And the moment I cast the shadows of that darkness underneath the fingers and in the palm, you start to get the feeling of two-dimensionality. And that base middle value of purple is still there. So now that I went darker, I can go a little bit lighter with the strokes you're seeing here. I'm thinking of it almost like a chisel, chiseling out those forms. Let's paint this face. I'm going to be looking at the reference of myself and kind of trying to mesh it with the cartoonish drawing of the Green Goblin's face, which is hyper-exaggerated. And I'm just thinking about how my lights are going to fall on the surface. And I'm really thinking about the planes, my friends. The planes. You ever seen one of those, heads of the planes of the face where they show the planes of the cheekbones and stuff? My brain is constantly thinking about that stuff. I liked how his eyes were looking crazy, and I liked the super exaggerated smile. A little bit of work on the building that's behind him. Notice we're keeping the contrast of it pretty light. Again, I do not want that building to compete with our Green Goblin. So I'm staying at higher values, certainly at first. Using my paint mall stick and positioning it at the top, I'm using it as basically a a compass almost, and I'm drawing out these vertical lines. And then I'm just connecting those vertical lines with a couple of rectangular windows. So though it looks like a complicated building, it's actually pretty simple. All right, let's paint the glider that he's on. Lots of different versions of gliders out there. This one just seemed to be a pretty good amalgamation of what I saw. Again, looking at a lot of skateboarders when I was referencing the Green Goblin, gymnasts, snowboarders, like you name it, all kinds of stuff where people are kind of skating. I had done an earlier sketch of it where he was almost ollieing above the thing and he wasn't even touching it with his feet, but I wanted him to be a little bit more connected and a little bit more solid in his stance. So we got his legs back down on it and his feet planted firmly. But just imagine that lower part his foot is on right there is a skateboard that he's kicking up, right? It just happens to connect to 3 times as much material as a skateboard. First I was going to do some kind of webbing thing, but then I decided just do flat planes. Notice I'm messing with warm and cool temperatures. The plane of the glider that's behind his foot is warm, but then as you get up towards the base of it or to the core of it, it gets blue. Look at the cross-hatching that also happened on the thigh of the Green Goblin. All oil paint cross-hatching, and basically the contours of those cross-hatchings are following the ellipses and the planes of the leg, and so they actually lend you to understand that it's got dimensionality to it. Bunch more buildings to do. And all of those clouds were really ambiguous. I didn't really draw them out at all in my earlier stage, so I kind of just had to figure them out, and that's kind of fun with clouds sometimes. I did a bit of a whiteout technique at the buildings up there. I glazed over some colors and then I lifted it out with the eraser, and now I'm going back in with some darks and just popping in some windows. Notice that building is a lot darker and less rendered than other buildings. Of course, we got to do the pumpkins. It's a basic sphere. If you've ever painted an apple, you get the idea. An apple with some ribbing and then some lit up holes inside of it. Not too difficult. You can also see a lot of the texture in the background there and in that building that's behind there. Again, try to keep things pretty quiet behind the pumpkin because we don't want to distract from the pumpkin. And just lighting up its eyes. And that goes a long way. Lighting up the eyes like that goes a long way to, convincing us that is what it is. A little spatter to activate it a little bit more. All right, let's finish up these clouds here. I can't be too lazy with them, but I'm being pretty loose. You can see the paint's just dripping off of there, just trying to get a lot of energy in that lower part. And this is the finished piece. All right, folks, I hope you enjoyed watching me paint that Green Goblin there. It was a total blast. I mean, maybe there's a few more superheroes I might like to paint, but the Green Goblin is one of the coolest because he doesn't have a mask covering his face. Well, I guess it is a mask, but you know what I mean? Like, he has features and eyes and mouths and stuff like that. So anyway, we'll have to see if I'm doing anything else for the Universes Beyond set. You'll just have to stay tuned for that. But I got to tell you, if this was the only one I did, it would be a joy to have painted this. All right, guys, take it easy. We'll see you on the next one.